All right, welcome everyone. My name is Bill Cavanaugh. I'm the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul University. It's a research center on the Church in the Global South, and we're delighted to invite an old friend of ours back this evening, Dan Castillo, to talk about confronting contagion, fear, and fascism, imagining a way out of the Anthropocene with Ignatius of Loyola. Dan is joining us from Tallahassee, Florida. He has managed to avoid, he is currently on a fellowship at the University of Notre Dame, but he wisely chose to hunker down in Tallahassee, Florida and avoid the snow and cold. So we want to welcome Dan. We want to welcome everyone who's joining us from near and far. We had, I think, close to 20 countries, people registered for the talk tonight, people from Wuhan and Istanbul and Melbourne and Rio de Janeiro, Athens, Oslo, and the list goes on and on. So a warm welcome to everyone scattered across the globe who's joining us tonight. Dan Castillo is Associate Professor of Theology at Loyola University in Maryland, and he is a Florida native, University of Florida undergraduate, and his PhD from the University of Notre Dame. His dissertation there has become his first book, which is really an exciting project. It's an ecological theology of liberation. And what Dan has done is to combine the insights of Latin American liberation theology, especially Gustavo Gutierrez, with ecological theology. And this is a project that has been needed to happen for a long time. And Dan has done it, a very exciting kind of confluence of two very interesting streams of theological thinking these days. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dan Castillo. Dan will speak for 35 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. I might ask a couple of questions first while people think, and then if you have a question, please use the Q&A function, and I'll make sure that your question is relayed to Dan. So again, thank you for joining us and welcome, Dan.
Thank you again, Bill, and thank you all for being here. As I begin, allow me the opportunity to express my gratitude to Bill Cavanaugh and DePaul Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology for offering me the opportunity to speak this evening. I'm especially grateful for the occasion to think explicitly about my own work as it relates to the nexus of sickness, health, and salvation. I've written this lecture with an undergraduate and general audience in mind. With that said, some of the points that I make, especially in the first part of the lecture, are necessarily technical and sometimes complicated, and I'll endeavor to clarify my argument as I go. So please feel free to ask clarifying questions at the end of the lecture. I've also put together a slideshow to accommodate the lecture this evening, and the slides consist largely of visual aids to help clarify the points I'm making verbally. Generally speaking, I'll refrain from commenting at length upon the slides. There will be a couple times when I pause and do say a couple things. I've organized the lecture into two parts. So the first part offers a reading of the signs of the times, which is to say, the first part will present a critical account of the world as it stands at this moment of history. And the second part of the lecture moves to consider how Christians and all persons of goodwill are called to inhabit the world as it currently exists. In so doing, I turn here in the second part of the lecture to the life and spirituality of Ignatius of Loyola, perhaps an unlikely source since he lived some 5 centuries ago, to help us discern a way forward to living healthfully on earth today. So without any further, with one point before we get into the lecture itself. I wanted to define one word that will come up or one term that will come up several times in the course of the lecture, and that's political ecology. And I would define this simply as the ways in which humans organize the oikos, that's the Greek, for household of the earth. And I've left oikos as it stands because it is the Greek oikos is the root for both ecology and economics. So when we think of political ecology, it's the ways in which humans organize the household of the earth, specifically keeping in mind the ecological and economic, socioeconomic dimensions of that household and how they interrelate. Confronting Contagion, Fear, and Fascism, Imagining a Way Out of the Anthropocene with Ignatius of Loyola. Today, the world exists in a state of planetary emergency. Here, I am not referring to the COVID pandemic, but rather to a planetary political ecological emergency that long predates the onslaught of the novel coronavirus. The dimensions of this political ecological emergency are manifold and daunting. Already, the sixth great extinction is unfolding, with humans threatening the existence of myriad species as human activity decimates ecosystems and habitats throughout the world. Concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide continue to escalate at an alarming rate, inducing a rise in the Earth's atmosphere, the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere. As the planet continues to warm, both the fluctuation and the extremes in weather patterns will intensify, creating increases in both flooding and drought in various parts of the planet. Moreover, the materially poor of this world, those who have contributed the least to and benefited the least from the acceleration of exploitative human activity, are also the most vulnerable to the negative effects of an increasingly unstable biosphere. Along similar lines, patterns of globalized environmental racism are being reinforced so that the lives of Black and brown persons throughout the world are disproportionately threatened by the volatility and violence of the emergency. In recent years, scientists have begun to name the era in which this planetary emergency is unfolding as the Anthropocene, the age of the human. The Anthropocene refers to a new geological era in which human activity has become a primary driver of biophysical change on a global scale. It is the political ecology of the Anthropocene. That is to say, it is the way in which human beings have worked to organize the patterns of life on Earth during this era that has given rise to the planetary emergency. This observation points to a key insight. If today the Earth is suffering from a profound sickness, and surely it is, this is because the human persons that are organizing the world are themselves sick. But this insight is too general. As I just noted, not all human beings have contributed to the emergency in equal ways. The era of the Anthropocene was not born out of the designs of a universal humanity. Instead, a very specific form of humanity has stood as the architect and driving force of the planetary emergency endemic to the Anthropocene. Thus, it is necessary to ask, who is this anthropos? Who is the human at the heart of the Anthropocene? What type of person has organized the political ecology of the planetary emergency? In order to begin to answer this question, it is necessary to understand that both the planetary emergency and the Anthropocene are rooted in the 500-year-long history of Western colonial and neo-colonial extractivism. As the 16th century Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas observed at the dawn of the 500-year project of Western extractivism, the Western colonizers were idolaters who developed the processes of extractive colonization in order to serve their own greed and lust for domination. Moreover, this greed was combined with a form of instrumental logic that sought to reduce complex patterns of ecosystemic life to the commodity of land, so that the wealth of the earth could be more readily extracted and concentrated in Western centers of power. This same instrumental logic, what Pope Francis talks about in terms of the technocratic paradigm, this same instrumental logic was also applied to complex cultural patterns of human life, aiming to reduce the value of human life to the commodity of labor, labor that was then employed in processes of extraction. What I just said was a mouthful, so let me reiterate. The greed that drives the 500-year project of colonial and neo-colonial extractivism has sought to reduce the life of the earth and human life to commodities that can be exploited for maximum profit by a small minority of humans. The result of this drive has been progressively expanding ecological destruction throughout the world, destruction that is now planetary in scale. Moreover, the architects of the 500-year project, in attempting to develop the most cost-effective extractive labor forms at the dawn of Western colonialism, developed anti-Black and anti-brown racist ideologies. These racist ideologies functioned as attempts to justify the institution of chattel slavery, an institution which is perhaps the clearest example of the attempt to reduce human life to the commodity of labor in the service of extraction. Thus, James Cone is correct when he writes, quote, "The logic that led to slavery and segregation in the Americas, colonization and apartheid in Africa, and the rule of white supremacy throughout the world, likewise produces the destruction of the earth and the biotic life. It is a mechanistic, instrumental logic that defines everything and everybody in terms of their contribution to the development and defense of white world supremacy," end quote. So who is the anthropos at the heart of the Anthropocene? Following loosely Sylvia Wynter, we can say he is the white, economistic, extractive, colonizing male. Following Sylvia Wynter, we can simply refer to this anthropos as, with a capital M, man. In the Anthropocene, the life of the earth has been organized to serve the greed, honor, and pride of man. The social and ecological effects of this have been devastating. In my consideration of the Anthropocene and the planetary emergency, I wish to make two more observations. First, to be clear, man is not any one person. Rather, like Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, man is a fictive ideal who is held up and celebrated as the fullness, the perfection of humanity. As a now globalized ideal to which humans are taught to pattern their lives after, man acts as a contagion, infecting psychological, spiritual, cultural, and societal norms with the sensibilities of this diseased and destructive exemplar. Within the sphere of the Western colonial and neo-colonial project, there is an unrelenting push to become disciples of man. This tutelage has a self-reinforcing effect. As persons conform to the ways of man, the sickness of man is made manifest and sustained in the systems of domination that they create, exhausting both the earth and the poor. Second, and importantly, when the effects of man's sickness begin to become unavoidably obvious, when the injustices of material inequality and anti-Black racism are unveiled, when climate change and extinctions unfold in ways that make plain the need for transformation, those persons and structures that serve man do not run to embrace the need for conversion. Indeed, they do not even respond like the rich young man in the Gospels who quietly and sadly turns away from Jesus. Instead, all too often, the persons and structures that are beholden to the white extractive colonial ideal of man strike back with grotesque forms of denialism and obfuscation. Like hard-hearted Pharaoh refusing to face the plagues unfolding around him, these persons and forces use their considerable resources to manufacture doubt and confusion amongst the general public. They proclaim that climate change is a hoax and place trained propagandists throughout networks of media to call into question scientific consensus. Those living at the heart of the lie begin to speak readily of fake news in order to obscure basic truths. Faced with the prospect of conversion, the forces of man promulgate the big lie and instead seek to invert reality, calling evil good and good evil. And human persons, already taught to reverence man and now facing the horrifying prospects associated with the planetary emergency, fearfully back away from reality and once more prostrate themselves to reverence man in search of protection. This is the context in which the idolatry of man takes the form of fascism. The oikos, the house that man has built, must be defended at all cost, after all. After all, as the disciples of man fallaciously proclaim, it is our house. Up to this point, I've been describing the dynamics that have shaped and sustained the contemporary planetary political ecological emergency. If this description sounds disturbingly familiar, that is because 2020 and the COVID pandemic, with the prizing of wealth over health, the defense of an individualistic freedom that considers nothing of freedom's responsibility to the other, the disproportional amount of death within communities of Black and Brown persons, and the gross denialism and obfuscation of basic truths can function as something of a précis, a summary of the 500-year project of Western colonial and neo-colonial exploitation. Moreover, COVID and 2020 are not simply a summary of what has driven us to the state of planetary emergency. They are also a warning of the disaster that lies in wait, even after vaccines are distributed worldwide. As such, this current historical moment is one that begs us to have ears to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the marginalized. It is a moment that cries out for conversion. Thus, the question that we must ask is this: how do those who conform to the ways of man convert? How do they begin to repair the wounded world and heal the sick political ecological order that they inhabit? Obviously, the issues are too immense and knotty to suggest any easy, straightforward solution. In my remaining time, I cannot offer a fully formulated roadmap from sickness to health. I would suggest, however, that all persons should, in fact, dedicate their lives to the struggles for conversion and health, amidst the sickness infecting a world that continues nonetheless to be worthy of immense love. To that end, I submit that the life and spirituality of Ignatius of Loyola can act in several ways as a helpful guide for cultivating a pathway forward, especially helpful for those who seek to make a break from the ways in which their lives have conformed to the ideal of man. So in the second part of my talk, I make a hard pivot and turn our attention to the figure of Ignatius in order to consider how his life might be instructive for the work of confronting our contemporary political ecological condition. So this is not a picture of Ignatius, it's a depiction of a courtier And this is a picture of the 80 Years' War, which just barely precedes Ignatius's life. Ignatius, a saint in the Roman Catholic Church and the founder of the Jesuit order, was born in 1491 in the Basque region of northern Spain into a family of minor nobility. During his adolescence, he lived as a courtier and soldier in service to the Spanish monarch. Throughout his youth, Ignatius was instructed in codes of honor and chivalry, and he wholeheartedly sought to conform to the ideal of the noble courtier. His desires, intellectual sensibilities, and energies were given over and shaped by this ideal as he imagined himself progressively gaining in worldly esteem. He deified the courtly life. This opening observation with regard to Ignatius discloses an initial point of contact between his life and the contemporary moment. Like so many persons whose logics and desires are today patterned upon the ideal of man, Ignatius's own logic and desire was organized upon a distorted and sick ideal. His life was ensnared in idolatry. It was while suffering from this sickness of delusional grandiosity and perverted ideals that Ignatius was quite literally laid low. In 1521, he was struck in the leg by a cannonball while attempting to defend a fortress in Pamplona from an attack by neighboring French soldiers. Ignatius's leg was shattered. The broken bones did not grow back properly, and he had to have the leg rebroken to be reset. He spent the better part of a year convalescing, working to return to physical health. And this should ring some bells for our experience today, our social body today, in the time of COVID. It is amidst this his physical convalescence that Ignatius began to experience a more profound psychological and spiritual turn toward health. During this time in which his life was brought to a dramatic standstill, Ignatius began to question the quality of the fictive ideal to which he was beholden. He began to discern the profane quality of the life of the courtier to which he had so long aspired. This change in perception, in no small part, was due to the fact that during his long months of recovery in which he was unable to walk, Ignatius had nothing to read except a book on the life of Christ and a book detailing the lives of the saints. Slowly but meaningfully, the exemplar of the courtier began to be replaced by the examples of the saints and the model of Christ, who came not to be served, but to serve. One point that I would stress here is that Ignatius initially had no interest in reading the lives of the saints or the life of Christ. He pleaded with his caretakers to find him the popular novels and stories of his time that celebrated the courtly life and the heroism of knights and nobles. In other words, Ignatius sought out stories and narratives that would feed and reinforce his sick ideals. It was only when he had no other option but to read the lives of the saints and the life of Christ that he acquiesced and took up engaging these works. I underscore this point because in the midst of the pandemic that has interrupted business as usual, we find ourselves at both a place of significant disadvantage and significant advantage relative to Ignatius. The advantage is, generally speaking, persons today have at their disposal multitudes of resources that can help them to call into question the fictive ideal of man and begin to name the sickness that has given rise to the Anthropocene and its planetary emergency. The disadvantage, however, is that unlike Ignatius, persons today also have access to innumerably more images, narratives, and media that can continue to celebrate the ways of man and distract us from reality, even as we wade through the liminal space of the pandemic, waiting to get back to business as usual. Today, persons must be intentional about stopping themselves. This is a point to which I'll return at the end of the lecture. At this point, two basic lessons emerge from Ignatius's post-Pamplona experience. First, the interruption of business as usual, as disconcerting and trying as it might be, creates liminal space that is fertile ground for conversion, for a turning. Second, the process of conversion is aided by acts of imagination. More specifically, conversion is aided by conceiving of new exemplars to whom our desires and logic might be reformed, might be patterned upon. Indeed, as Ignatius underwent his profound conversion, he did not shy away from naming his former ideals as sick and sinful in their character. Along these lines, he found that in the imaginative act of naming the sin and sickness to which he was beholden, he could work to surrender his will more fully to God. This dynamic, the dynamic of naming and surrendering sinful ideals and desires, is perhaps most evident in Ignatius's meditation on the two standards, which comes at the end of the second week of the spiritual exercises that he developed in the years subsequent to his own initial conversion. In this meditation, now let me pause and say, Ignatian spirituality is a cataphatic spirituality. Cataphatic, it uses images. So it invites you not to meditate in silence and in like darkness devoid of thought, but to engage your imagination, engage images, and use all of your senses to commit your intellect and your will more deeply to God. So this is evidence, this is characteristic then in the meditation on the two standards. In this meditation, Ignatius asked the exertion, the one who was undertaking the exercises, to imagine the world as a battlefield, as a site of struggle. Upon this site of struggle, the exercient, continuing in this exercise of imagination, finds that there are two standards, two flags flying on opposite ends of the landscape. One is the standard of Christ. The other is the standard of Satan. For the purposes of this lecture, one can imagine them as the flag of health and the flag of sickness. Around each of these flags, the peoples of the world begin gathering, choosing the side to which they will belong. Imagining this scene, Ignatius invites the exercient to commit her life more deeply to Christ, to health, to intentionally place her life under Christ's standard, and in so doing, reject the standard of Satan. Particularly noteworthy in this meditation are the characteristics that Ignatius attributes to the differing types of lives lived under these juxtaposed flags. Under the standard of Satan, life is organized by a desire for riches, which will lead to worldly honors and inflate one's pride. Thus, to follow the way of Satan is to seek to exalt oneself over and against all other creatures. It is to seek a way of life that aims to force all things to serve you. In my view, Ignatius's description of the standard of Satan is a direct reflection of the attributes he came to understand characterizing the life of the courtier that he had previously idealized. Along these lines in our world today, that is to say in the context of the Anthropocene, I would affirm that the desire for riches and honor to feed one's hubris certainly describe the ways of man. Recall Cohn's view that the political ecology of the Anthropocene is organized in order to exalt and defend the idolatrous doctrine of white supremacy. Here then, Ignatius's meditation on the two standards offers us a way to meditate upon and explicitly name the ways of man and the political ecology of the Anthropocene as sick and sinful. In this context, to choose the flag of sickness, to choose riches, honor, and pride, is to choose the ideal of man. It is to choose whiteness, falsity, and greed. In contradistinction to the life lived under the banner of Satan, life lived under the standard of Christ is one that is characterized by spiritual and even material poverty. Rather than seeking worldly honors, the disciple of Christ freely and courageously accepts insults from the world, organized as it is by man. Both of these characteristics work to cultivate a deep sense of humility in the disciple. Instead of seeking to exalt oneself, the disciple of Christ, the seeker of health, learns to serve God through serving and caring for neighbor and earth. In effect, Ignatius asks the exercient to willfully commit to a different way of life in the world. He invites the exertion to identify a radically new exemplar and pattern their life after that model. Along these lines, perhaps the most powerful image from Scripture for imagining not man, but a new humanity is found in the second creation narrative of Genesis. In that story, God, after planting the Garden of Eden, calls the human person to serve and care for the soil and all that God has formed from the soil. In the second chapter of Genesis, then, one finds that to be fully human, to be truly human, is not to exalt oneself over and against creation. Instead, to be fully human is to protect and keep creation. It is to inhabit the symbolic vocation of the gardener. Drawing upon imagery such as this, one can begin to conceive of new ways of orienting one's life and committing one's energies in service to the world. In its totality, the meditation on the two standards offers exertions a way to begin to imagine themselves confronting and transforming the world structured as it is by sin. Ignatius provides us a way to start to imagine ourselves moving out of the Anthropocene and making a break with the deification of man. Ignatian spirituality in general offers us vital tools for naming the ways in which the sickness of man, his greed, his lust for honor, and his pride have imperiled the life of the world so that we can begin to move toward health. Now, I am trained as a systematic constructive theologian, but above all, I'd understand myself as a pastoral theologian, one who is concerned with the practical matters of everyday life. So this brings me to my final point. Recall, as I noted above, Ignatius's conversion was facilitated by the fact he had months of quiet. This is seldom anyone's experience today, even in the midst of the pandemic, and perhaps especially in the midst of the pandemic. Ignatius, however, was also convinced that a short daily practice of reflecting upon how God was working in our lives throughout the day could energize and sustain the reformation of our lives in service to God. He called this prayerful practice the examen. And there's myriad examples, forms of this prayer that you can find online. But in brief, the examen invites one at the end of each day to reflect on where God is working in their life that day, how they cooperated with God, and how they failed to cooperate with God. In light of my foregoing argument, I'd suggest that this daily exercise can help us to continually imagine ways out of the Anthropocene as God works to move humanity away from the greed and pride that characterize the ways of man and toward the ways of the gardener whose task is to serve and care and renew the face of the earth. Of course, the task is not simply to imagine ways out, but to begin to embody those imaginings. Thank you. And the last thing I will show you is two brief suggestions for continued reading. The first is a short piece that I wrote that's a kind of creative meditation on the two standards, thinking about the ecological crisis. It's in the Other Journal. And the last point, so if you want to take a screenshot, you can. The last book that I found immensely helpful in working with anyone from general audiences to graduate students is Dean Brackley's The Call to Discernment in Troubled Times. New perspective on the transformative wisdom of Ignatius. Thank you all for your time.